My talk is about understanding men, and I'm going to start with some good news. There are men in our world who've got great relationships with their wife, are loved by their children, and have got a meaningful job. Now the bad news, some facts about men in our so-called developed world. 70% of people with addictions are men. How widespread is this? In the 2019 UN Happiness Report, it's estimated in America 1 in 2 adults suffers from one or more addictions, like drugs, alcohol, online gaming, pornography. If we think of the cities around the world and the homeless, 9 out of 10 men are the homeless. In terms of prisons, 90% of people locked up are also men. Suicides, 8 out of 10 suicides are men. And sadly, with our children with learning difficulties, behavioral difficulties, 80% of them are boys. If we think, what do we and our children hear on the news every evening at home? We hear news about men, stories about men who are terrorists. We hear stories about men committing gun crime, knife crime, in wars, and abusing both boys, girls, and women. When I was born, men had as role models very often world leaders. Winston Churchill was still alive, Martin Luther King, and President Kennedy. These were men who had moral authority. They inspired us to be free. They brought us together. If we look at recent times, what's happened, our trust in our governments has collapsed, and our trust in men also. If we look at this picture of a prison fence, this represents the culture of men. And this talk is to try and understand this culture and men more deeply, so we can free men to more meaningful lives. When I was in my 20s and 30s, I had 13 different bosses. I worked for 2 companies and I put on 13 pounds in weight. I used to wake up in the morning thinking about work. I'd go into the office and we'd work together, but not really as a team. We didn't really trust each other. We worked separately. It was very slow to get things moving. It was like sort of working or moving in glue. I'd come home at the end of the day, and more often than not, I'd end up having an argument with my daughter. And I remember at that time, I thought it was her fault, not realizing that what she needed was my attention. In these days, my friends, my mates were very important to me. We used to go out having a beer on a Saturday evening, talking about football, real male camaraderie. But even at that time, I remember thinking, we had like an unwritten rule in our culture. We never talked about anything serious about our lives. So why was I working and commuting 50, 60 hours a week in those days? Because I needed to get over and survive reorganizations which happened in our company. And after working with one company for 11 years, I didn't get over. I was let go from the organization. How did I feel? Yeah, I felt rejected, very much like earlier in my life. Because when I was 8 years old, my mother died. When I was 9, the wicked stepmother showed up. And when I was 13, she said to my father, either he goes or I go. So I was brought up in between 13 and 18 in different children's homes. Before I was made redundant, a colleague at work who saw I was struggling, she talked to me about a friend of hers who'd seen a therapist. And so I did. I went to see a therapist. And I'll never forget the first time that I saw her, because I felt for the first time in my life peace of mind. She really listened to me. I really listened to myself. I wasn't so busy in my head like I'd been all of the time. The next time I went to see her, she said to me, tell me about how you see your family in your mind. She gave me some matchsticks. So I put the matchsticks on the table. My father, my brother, my sisters. She said, where's the matchstick for your mother? I said, well, my mother, she's not in my mind. There isn't a place for her. Oh, she said. And what I had to learn, I had some grieving to do. I had to find a place for my mother in my mind. A couple of sessions later, she asked me, she said, well, tell me about the relationship with your father. I said, well, we don't really have a relationship, or certainly not a good relationship. He's, a typical father. He's very distant, critical, cold, doesn't really have many friends. So she gave me some homework. She said, what I'd like you to do, I'd like you to write 2 letters to your father. You don't have to send them, but I'd like you to write them. One about anger, all of the things that had happened all those years ago, and one about love, because he was my only parent. So I did. And suddenly all these emotions that I had been pushing away for decades came out. She then said, I'd like you to go and see your father. I'd like you to try and understand his background, what was going on when he was young. So I went to see him, and we had some really sort of powerful conversations. What did I learn about my father? Well, the first thing I learned was that when he was a child, when he was brought up, his father was never around. He used to work in a factory 6 days a week. So the model that he grew up with was that his mother ran the whole family. What I also learned, my father went away to Egypt to do military service for a year. And when he came back, his mother said to him as he came in the house, "Hey up, it's our John." She didn't cuddle him. She didn't say she'd missed him. She said, "Hey up, it's our John." And what I started to really realize was how emotions in the 1930s and 40s in England were completely suppressed. So I started to really understand my dad for the first time in my life. And that was crucial, because when I understood why he was the way he was, I could start forgiving him for all of the stuff that had happened those years ago. That had a huge impact on my life. After I fixed it with my dad, I felt, complete, whole, connected. Before, all of the years before I'd fixed it with my father, I had a feeling, that something was missing, that I didn't belong, that I wasn't good enough, and I was always trying to prove myself. And what I now realize was all of those years, I used to fill this gap, this thing that was missing. I used to fill it with beer and cigarettes, like a lot of men do. A little while after this, my sister in Australia, she sent me a book by an Australian psychologist called Stephen Biddulph, an astonishing book. Right at the start of the book, he says the following. He says, the premise of this book is a harsh one, but with hope at its heart. Most men are not fully alive. They have no real purpose and very little joy. And that is what we have somehow come to accept as normal manhood, although deep down we and our children and our wives hunger for more. And if you think about little boys, if you think about a boy 7, 8 years old, I've got a nephew who was that age a few years ago, and he was delightful. He was emotional, spontaneous. He would be glad, sad, mad, scared, all in a couple of hours. He was full of life. And what happens to the boys who are that age, when they get to be 18 or older, they're not expressive. They don't express their emotions. They lose their spirit. What Biddle says in his book, chapter 4 in the book, is called Fixing It with Your Father. And often in groups he asks men a very important question: what's the relationship like with your father? He says the answer is always the same. 3 out of 10 will say, we don't have a relationship anymore. It's broken. We have no contact. 3 out of 10 men will say, well, when we're together for a couple of hours, it's very prickly. We get wound up. We get irritated. It's like cactusy. 3 out of 10 will do better than that. They'll call each other once a week. They'll go to parties together, maybe mow the lawn together. But really this is about duty. And only 1 out of 10 men will say, well, my father, he's an emotional anchor in my life. What a terrible statistic. 1 out of 10 men in our society have got a good relationship with their father. And crucially, in this chapter of the book, he says we can change this. He says by having powerful conversations and understanding more deeply how our fathers were brought up and how their minds worked and why they're the way that they are, we can change where we are. Even if our father's no longer alive, we can change our connection with them. And sadly, we may find out by having those conversations that our father is still somehow untrustworthy. And in that case, Biddle says, we need to find another father figure. Boys need a role model. They need to learn how to become a man. And if you look at our society now, very often boys, if you go through a whole day, they start the day when they're with their mother. They go to school where 80% of the teachers are women. And they come home and often their dad is exhausted or he's not in touch with them. So they have very little contact with their fathers. This is not how it used to be. Only the last 10 generations since the Industrial Revolution, when men started going to factories and offices, has this been the case. For 20,000 generations, boys spent a huge amount of time with their fathers and older men, farming and hunting. So now let's have a look. What is the culture like of men and boys in our society? What does the culture teach us? Well, it teaches us one thing. I must be tough. That's the only thing, the key thing we learn from the culture of men and boys. What that makes people, of course, is aggressive. And a lot of men and boys are very aggressive. We reinforce this culture, sometimes without realizing it, by calling our sons or each other wimps or pussies or girlies. And how does this culture work? What basically happens is, because we have to be so tough, we close down. We don't listen to ourselves, our inner voice, our feelings, our emotions. And we close off from other people. So we don't share how we're feeling. We don't learn from other people. We don't express ourselves. And we become very isolated. And what this means is, if we've got to be tough, we can't be vulnerable. And we have to be vulnerable to grow as men, as human beings. If we're not vulnerable, we stop growing. And that's what happens to so many boys and men. So back to my story. As I said, I fixed it with my dad all of those years ago. And about 20 years ago, after that, a couple of years later, I got another job as a marketing manager. And I worked again the same way for a couple of years, until we went on a leadership program, which somehow changed the way we were talking to each other, communicating with each other. It had a huge effect on the team, and particularly on me, because somehow that woke me up. And I came home at the end of that leadership program and said to my wife, I'm going to stop being a marketing manager I'm going to be a leadership coach. I just knew inside of me that that's what I wanted to be. So for the last 20 years, that's been my job. The difference between this job and that job is unbelievable. It's magical. Because instead of having to force myself and drive myself to do things every day, I now do what I love to do, what I want to do. That's also made a big difference in my home life. I've had more time and energy to put into my family, my wife and my children. And this has given me the most joy and meaning in my life. My wife is from a warm, caring family. And the one thing I've learned from her about bringing up children is how we need to be, as parents, a container for the emotions for our children. So when my son says he's frightened, my job is not to deny it or to stop it or fix it. It's to come alongside him and let him express his emotions so that he gets used to expressing it and having feelings. Because emotions come and emotions go. The great problem with men in our society is they haven't learned to express emotions, so they get stuck in anger or anxiety, which again leads to addictions. If I think about my time as a leadership coach, in the last 18 years, I've probably done more than 1,000 different workshops in 20 different countries. I've worked with more than 100 leaders, mostly men. What have I learned? In most organizations and teams, we still have a tough guy culture with people competing, not really building relationships, not trusting each other, and poor results. I've also seen a growing number of other organizations and teams which have a better culture, a culture with more trust, more of a team feeling that people enjoy and flourish in working in. And crucially here, they have much better results. So in summary, what we need for men across the world, we need men to be free. We need to liberate men from this tough guy culture. At the moment, there's a very serious crisis happening in our world. And crisis has got two different symbols in Chinese. The first one is danger. But the second symbol is opportunity. We have to use the opportunity during this crisis to free men to much more meaningful lives. For that we need heroes. We need men with courage, which comes from the Latin word cor, meaning to talk from our hearts. In terms of the call for action, the first thing we have to do, we have to choose from our mates a friend with whom we can have proper conversations about our life, very much like women already have. We need to find a therapist to help us feel and express our emotions again. We need to fix it with our father and our sons and break this crazy cycle. We need to find a job that's our vocation, that we love to do, which gives us energy. We need to get closer to our partners in terms of building a relationship. We can be a container for our kids' emotions and experience the joy of being a dad. We can get energized and fit by playing the sports that we love to do. And these steps can lead us to breaking away from our addictions, which numb our feelings and cost us so much energy. Biddle says the most important of these steps is getting away from the material world and getting more connected with our spirit and nature. And finally, I'd like you to spread the word about understanding men and change the worlds around you. And lastly, I'm going to quote from the end of the Manhood book. This talk is a signpost. Don't argue with it. but go where it points if it feels right to you. Or go somewhere else, but go. Go deep. Go free. There's a big life waiting.